be doing in the future. And as my colleague Elizabeth Brady, who you will hear from during this session, said, it's very rare that we get to see a truly groundbreaking study and not something that we have seen before. And so we are so excited to continue this conversation. If you missed the first session, no problem. It's available on YouTube, and that link will be shared with you at the end of the session, along with the link to this session we are doing today. We will also welcome our speakers at the Spectrum Conference at the end of the month for a session concentrated on the overlap between their study and LGBTQIA+ issues, as well as a session in September that will address the overlap with ODEI. Please do join us for those. If you would like to use closed caption, we are grateful to the Student Conduct Institute for, again, offering closed captioning services. We have a professional captioner here. Please go to the bottom of the Zoom and use the CC live transcript for that, and those will show up. We are so excited to get into a session talking about sexual geography. What is sexual geography? Like many of you, I attended college. For me, it was the State University of New York at Oswego, where for most of my time there, I lived in corridor-style residence halls. And I never thought about it until, a few months ago. But when you would have friends over, no matter what the situation, platonic, romantic, or whatever, well, the only places you could sit were the floor, an old desk chair, which if it was still working, probably had your books on it or something like that, or the bed. We didn't have couches. We didn't have dining room tables or parlors or sitting areas in our corridor style housing. And then you would go to parties, and where were those parties held, and who had the power over those parties, and where were alcohol and other items available, and where were they not, and who had access to that and who didn't. And most of us just sort of assume this is the world we live in, right? Like, the mail comes 6 days a week, and the sun comes up in the morning and goes down in the evening, and this is how it has to be. Well, today, Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan are going to have a conversation with our colleague Karren Bee-Donohoe about what we have, and more importantly, about what we could have as we look forward to the future. Jennifer is a professor at Columbia University, Shamus a professor at Princeton. Their full bios are on the website. I am pleased to introduce and turn things over to our colleague Karren Bee-Donohoe, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Capital Facilities and who is a true, and every time we ask, friend to the programming that we do and the efforts we have in sexual and interpersonal violence prevention and response. There's not a time we've asked Karren for a favor that she hasn't said yes and so along with my colleague Elizabeth Brady, I'm so pleased to welcome Karren. Karren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm saying here that I am really pleased when Joe asked me to moderate this discussion, though I will say I was a bit uncertain this time. Trying to understand how my work experience in Capital Facilities integrated with the discussion of sexual assaults on college campuses. But they said, well, you've got to read the book, right? So I read, and then I reread the book, Sexual Citizens, and now I have a very different perspective. And as a result, I do believe this is a topic that needs more discussion with campus facilities planning staff and with design professionals when developing housing and other student-centric spaces on campus. So personally, I've been involved in higher ed facility development for over 37 years. And as part of my work at Binghamton University, I was involved in design for at least 3,000 residential beds. I've been involved in design for buildings where student activities take place. But what the book helped me realize is nowhere in the process for creating physical space on campus did we focus the discussion on how the design of spaces could impact the potential for sexual assault. Rather, I recall many times when instead space that was originally planned as floor lounges would be shifted to student bedrooms because of the need for revenue from the students. During today's discussion, you'll see how those decisions can actually have consequences beyond the financial impact. In today's session, as Joe mentioned, it's the second of 4 planned discussions with the authors. We'll focus on the topic of sexual geography and how place or geography of the campus environment can influence the potential for sexual assault. This session's really about raising awareness and bringing this piece into the discussion in the realm of the facilities planner. As part of that discussion, we will consider not only how design of the physical geography of colleges and universities plays a part, but also how residential housing assignments, who controls various space on and off campus, can expose students to situations where sexual encounters can more easily reach that fine line where the encounters become assault. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to start by asking Jennifer if she would just summarize the 3 organizing elements of the book: sexual project, sexual geographies, and sexual citizenship.
I'd be happy to, but first, wow, what a great introduction. So Karren, thank you so much for being in conversation with us. And we're so grateful to Joe, to Elizabeth, and to the SUNY Arrive Center for giving us the opportunity to share our work with so many people. So first, I'll open with a story, because the book, as you know, Karren, is very narrative driven, and this will give people who haven't had a chance to read it a sense of what it feels like to pull back the curtain on how students live on campus. So Austin was in many ways such an engaging interview subject. We interviewed him late in his time in college, and he had a girlfriend. In fact, he and his girlfriend figure in the only really spicy sex scene in the book. He had developed nicknames for the kinds of orgasms that she had, and he was doing his part to try to narrow the campus orgasm gap, as well as just to be a good boyfriend and a good person. And so it was hard for him to acknowledge what had really happened in what he initially described as a weird experience, where he was shuffled off early in freshman year into someone else's bedroom so that his roommate could be alone with his roommate's girlfriend. And so he went into this bedroom late at night. There was a girl in one of the beds. She raised her head, mumbled that she was pretty drunk and she didn't want to do anything, and then, lay back down. And that's kind of weird, right? When someone comes into your room who you barely know, like, why should you have to establish a sexual boundary? But worse, he didn't respect that. He got in bed with her and started to touch her body. And then he stopped. And later in the interview, we asked him, well, what is a sexual assault? And he knew. He had taken that class like everyone else at Columbia and Barnard. And he said, it's any unwanted sexual anything. And then he became very distraught. And in the book, we argue, this is just sort of like the bigger point of Sexual Citizens, that rather than thinking, oh, Austin's a terrible person, certainly what he did was a harmful thing, but that thinking bigger in a transformational way about prevention involves digging into the social roots of that moment rather than just focusing on the personal qualities of the people involved. And so today we're going to dig deep into the idea of sexual geographies, but first to sort of lay out the conceptual architecture of the book, but not in a way that is as heavy as the word conceptual architecture maybe sounds. So the first idea, sexual geographies, is the idea that space organizes both sexual interactions and sexual assaults. And you can see in the way that, Austin and his roommate were in a double, as most freshmen are. His roommate reasonably, and his roommate and his girlfriend wanted to be alone. So he was pushed off into a different space. That was sort of a product of the sexual geography. So the sexual geography is space not as a backdrop to what people do, but actually as a sort of third character. And it's important for our conversation because our A game in public health is not yakking at people to act better. It's reimagining the environment so it's less likely that people will act in a way that they hurt themselves or other people. And so sexual geographies is really the door into taking a public health approach to sexual assault prevention on campus. The two other big ideas in the book, which we're going to talk about less today, are sexual projects and sexual citizenship. Sexual projects, the kind of idea maybe that only academics would come up with, answers the question of what is sex for, which you might think you know what sex is for. It's for pleasure or to have babies, but none of the students we spoke with were trying to have babies. And a lot of the sex that they had was not so pleasurable. And so you can see in the story I told about Austin, his sexual project was just gaining experience because he was so anxious. He felt like everyone else was way ahead of him, which likely they were not, in the sort of sexual experience accrual department. And then the third idea, sexual citizenship, points to the fact that everyone has the right to choose their own sexual experiences, and that they need to understand that other people have those same rights. So in that interaction between Austin and the young woman whose name we never learned, he was very clear about choosing his own sexual experiences and less attentive to hers. In fact, not attentive at all to hers. So those are the three big ideas. And today we're gonna, as Karren said, take a really deep dive into sexual geographies as a way to think about campus prevention in a way that is multi-sectoral and goes beyond just telling people to act better.
Okay, well, thank you. That helps a lot, I think, to set the stage. So during your study, what was it that you saw in the organization of housing in particular that impacted the potential for assaults to take place?
So, our research was done at Columbia and Barnard, which is sort of a mostly residential campus. And so, a lot of what we saw is based upon something like that. And I think later in the conversation, we can talk about other kinds of campuses that may have different setups and experiences. But, one thing that we saw was the sort of naturalization of giving older students better space and giving older students more control over space. So, it sort of makes sense because you think as people age through college, they should get better things because they have acquired, they've earned it in some way. That's kind of the narrative that we have. But there are unintended consequences to that. One of the things that it does, for example, when we give seniors better housing, more likely to have social spaces attached to their housing and or singles, it ends up funneling younger students into spaces controlled by older students. And those younger students are often inexperienced with things like sex, with things like drinking, with the basic rules of college and campus life, and that can put them at risk. And so one of the things that we look at when asking about sexual geographies is the relationship between geographies and power, or between space and power, and how frequently our rules about space augment already powerful people. So they give more power to people who already have power. And that kind of lens helps us think about why it makes sexual assault not like, it doesn't directly cause it or make it totally inevitable, but it makes it more likely. And really importantly, it makes it something that's kind of modifiable. Because when we look at behavior, right, it's really hard to affect people's behaviors, but sometimes we can change the context that would change the behavior. So let me get a little bit more practical in the answer. So I already talked about age, how as students get older, they get access to better space, and this funnels younger students into those spaces. There are other things that Joe talked about furniture, right? Like if you go back at 2 a.m. to somebody else's room, one of the things that happens is you move into that like room and there's like 4 pieces of furniture, a bureau, a chair, a desk, and a bed. And if you're going to sit with the person, you're going to sit on a bed, and beds have social meanings, like it or not. Again, it doesn't make it inevitable that there's a sexual assault, but it can change sort of the context of a situation in ways that make it really challenging. Sometimes the cost of housing in schools has a big impact on this. So by the cost of housing, we mean that some schools provide different kinds of housing to students based upon what they can pay. So if you can pay more money, you get access to better housing. And, it seems like a reasonable thing to do because how else are you going to distribute it? But that gives wealthier students who are more resourced, more powerful, probably more comfortable at the institution, more power. There's also the question of roommates that sort of came up in the story that Jennifer told about Austin, and how it is that, roommates, it's a complicated issue because they can be really beneficial for students who are just becoming part of campus life, but they do in some ways sort of negate the sexual citizenship of students. They make it harder for students to have control over the kinds of sexual situations that they want to be in. And especially if we're looking at heterosexual contexts, roommate situations frequently funnel women into men's rooms because of the kind of acceptability of men hosting and of asking their roommates to leave, and the relative unacceptability of that. And that gender dynamic is really important. Now, at Columbia, one of the things that we saw was over the course of our research, how there were things that could be done about it. And so one of the examples was, over the course of our research, we had a series of advisory boards. So we had a student advisory board that we met with weekly to talk about what we were finding, what we were researching, et cetera. But we also had an advisory board of critical administrators. And so these were like people who were in important positions. And our dream, Karren, would have been to have you in the room because we would want the person who's sort of responsible. And actually at Columbia, we had the person who was responsible for housing and dining as one of our critical sort of administrators as part of the research. And I think for a while, Scott Wright, I'll name check him because he did some great work, was wondering, what am I doing here? Why have I been asked to be part of this? But then when Jennifer was presenting the results at one point in time and sort of talking about the room decor, furniture, nowhere to go problem, a light bulb went on in Scott's head. And he was like, there's something I could do about this. And what he decided to do was on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights to leave one of the sort of more intimate dining halls, JJ's, open late into the evening, sort of almost 24 hours. And the idea was that you could leave a party and someone could say, hey, you want to go back to my room? And you could say, no, do you want to go to JJ's instead? You had an option to go somewhere that wasn't a bedroom. And that's sort of looking at how you don't necessarily have to funnel people back into these spaces, and there may be opportunities for that. The point of all of this is to think about transforming landscapes, not just to sort of lecture students. That is, you need to not rape people, you need to act better, you need to not drink so much. All of those things may be good lessons, but fundamentally, if we can transform the environment, it's going to, in many ways, create different opportunity structures for students. If we think about the landscape of this interaction right now, it's opened up all kinds of opportunities and all kinds of constraints. So right now, there are problems with the fact that we are not co-present with one another in a physical space. But there are also opportunities to that. There are lots of people here as part of this discussion who couldn't necessarily be here because, we'd all have to travel long distances and, maybe we couldn't get time off, et cetera, et cetera. And so, this is a kind of space that has transformed the conditions of possibility. And it's not like a transformation is going to make everything wonderful and possible. It's going to come with negative outcomes too, but it might be a dimension that we can kind of manipulate a little bit to potentially create healthier campuses where everyone can thrive.
Wow, that's a great response to everything that's going on at the campus and how different things can happen. And one of the things you mentioned was social spaces. And Jennifer, can you add on? Are there things that you found with social spaces that created more or less opportunity for the encounters to lead to assaults?
Yeah, the same analytic that Shamus was applying to housing holds more generally for the way that students move through the campus environment. If you think about driving, for example, driving is a pretty dangerous behavior, right? And yes, people take driver's ed. Driver's ed, it turns out, doesn't have a huge impact on driving safety. What does have a big impact are modifications to the environment. So things like speed bumps and curb cuts, the Vision Zero that has been rolling out in cities around the world has measurably reduced pedestrian fatalities by not making people better drivers, but by changing the environment. And so similarly, there are ways that we can think about, what are the speed bumps and curb cuts that we could create on campus to help people maybe slow things down a little bit, but also to change the balance of power in some important ways. One of the things that we talk about in pretty great depth in Sexual Citizens is how the organization of drinking on campus has to do with the allocation of social space. There's a lot of beating up on fraternities that people do, and we don't do that, but we do point out that fraternities, it's not just that they're men's organizations, but that it's a dense concentration of students who are not just men, they also tend to be white, they tend to be heterosexual, they tend to be wealthy, and they tend to be older. So that's many different forms of power. And if you add on to that, the disproportionate access to very lightly policed social space, you can see that that becomes a center for socializing on campuses in a way that reflects a lot of policies, but is not inevitable. And so our argument is not like shut down the frats, because that is not a winning argument, but rather, if you want students on your campus to drink less in general, then think about allocating social space to groups of students who tend to drink less. There's really good evidence that students of color, and in particular, Black students, don't drink as much as white students. And so rather than thinking about taking space away from existing groups that have really prestigious social space, thinking about expanding or making other spaces available to students is one way to shift the balance of power. Students, so basically it would be spaces for all kinds of less powerful students. That means for first year students, for queer students, for all of the sort of minoritized student identities. And this is not, I just want to be really clear about this. This is not program space. So like, yes, it's important for minoritized students to have club spaces so that they can host events, but we're talking about hosting parties. There's a very scene that we describe in great depth in the book of a group of Latino students who host a party. And sort of the main event in that party is dancing and celebrating the night of Mexican independence. And so like, yeah, there's some alcohol, but no one is going really hard because that's not their form of socializing. And so, and not to like generalize about all Latinos everywhere, but just to make the point that like that is, that story in the book is a sort of microcosm of the kinds of transformations that campus administrators could do in collaboration with student groups. One thing that we saw as sort of a challenge to that is when you ask students, at least when you ask the Columbia and Barnard students, what kind of spaces do they want? They would say more study space. And so Shamus and I, when we had the students tour us through the dorms, there was a beautiful lounge on the top floor of Shapiro that had, like skyline view. And I was like, oh, this would be a very nice social lounge. It was full of desks and chairs. Like at the students' request, it had been made over into a study space. There was another lounge that the student toured us through, and it had all the charm of like an airport waiting room, and with cubicles and whiteboards, and we said, well, Nick, like, what is the most fun thing that ever happened here? And he said, well, maybe when the therapy dogs came to play with us. And like our hearts shattered into a million tiny pieces, thinking like, yes, students wanted more study space because the library, even though Columbia's library system is very rich and beautiful, still they felt like the libraries were too crowded and they wanted a place to study in their dorm so they didn't have to go outside in the snow. But think about how you could transform the experience of being in that dorm by furnishing it with some, if you'll forgive me, some like shitty old couches, right? Just so like people could hang out and be together. And then we found that the intensity of students in terms of their engagement in campus life sometimes pushed back against there being free spaces available. In one of the freshman dorms, there was a beautiful lounge, but there was a policy that student activity groups could book it. And so like, imagine if you got back to your house at the end of a long day and you wanted to just like chill with your family, but you couldn't sit in the living room because someone was working there. They're like, nope, sorry, there's a meeting here. And so then you have to go to your bedroom. So, and that is actually, it's a very good reflection of how the spatial environment, it doesn't just come to be, it reflects a set of underlying policies which can be changed. Another one of the great things that Scott did in conversation with us was to change that the dorm lounge reservation policy so that those spaces were then available to all students so that they could mix and meet people and hang out with their friends in this sort of like liminal shared space. So there's a lot of opportunities, not just, I guess the point is not just think about the spaces, but think about what are the institutional decisions that have led to that spatial allocation and how could they be different?
That's great. And what I really like is when you said that, what you're really trying to do is, create some speed bumps and curb cuts and some ways of better controlling the environment to make it safer, to make there to be less chance for a problem encounter because of the changes you've made. So are there other points about campus geographies, for example, how they impact the social equity and the power and the inequalities that can be changed and could help with this problem?
Absolutely. Jennifer and I are building off a long tradition of research on sexual assault that talks about sexual assault as gender and power. So, the argument is that sexual assault is a consequence of an unequal set of gendered power relations in society. But one of the things that we know is that, not all sexual assaults happen in heterosexual contexts, and that gender is not the only form of power that on campus. And perhaps a third thing to note is that, the way that we understand gender today isn't just in terms of gender on its own. We think about it intersectionally. That is, we think about how you can't really understand gender without bringing in a racial lens, or without thinking also about the dynamics of class and sexuality. And so, this perspective then brings in, it isn't to say that the gender and power view is wrong, it's that it's incomplete, and that we need to sort of think about the multiple forms of power that make sexual assault more likely. Now, the tie between that and space is really important. Jennifer and I, we kind of live this a little bit because we've seen colleagues cry over the size of their offices. And the tears were because the office didn't fully reflect their status, or someone who they thought of as not as important as they were had a better office with better lighting, or a better location, or it was bigger, or something like that. And, the way that space and power are deeply intertwined in our sensibilities, the idea of a corner office when you get to a certain position within an organization, it's sort of deeply entrenched. And so it's not easy to sort of transcend that very thing, but that those forms of power are multifaceted in how they represent the different kinds of experiences that students have. So the Queer Student Lounge at Columbia was in the basement of a dorm and was a pretty terrible room. And there were other spaces on campus where students had an entire building that was pretty beautiful. And those differences are really palpable, and they frequently reflect existing societal differences. So, thinking about the spaces that were accessible to the Muslim students, for example, they didn't really have space. They just kind of had to share it with other groups of people. And our point here isn't that every group should get a space, because part of what we're pointing to is that campuses are engineered cultures. They're places where we make really deliberate decisions about creating contexts of encounter. So those contexts of encounter are where we bring students who often come from very segregated backgrounds together into a space where they can meet one another. And so, we would ask why you would engineer such a diverse student body if you also don't build spaces for them to interact, for them to have encounters with one another in really dynamic ways. So the already established organized the spaces are sort of already organized to cater to affinity groups, but we often don't see this. So let me put that a little bit more clearly. Like, campus is already kind of organized around an affinity group. The affinity group is like whiteness and masculinity. We just don't see that as an affinity group because of the unmarked status of whiteness and the unmarked status of men on campus. And if we can begin to sort of reflect on why it is that socialization spaces are organized around whiteness and masculinity, and think about how we can organize that out, not by banning white men from having access to space, but by thinking, how is it that we can change the opportunity structure to lift up other groups? And Jennifer said this before, but it kind of bears repeating, that the organization of campus life around whiteness and masculinity also organizes socialization around drinking a lot. Because men drink significantly more than women. I mean, way more than women in a college context. That's not to say that women don't drink or that there aren't some women who drink a lot. But overall, if men have control over a space, there's going to be a lot of drinking in that space. And if white men have a lot of control over space, there's going to be even more drinking in that space, because white men tend to be the group of people who drink the most. And so as we're having these conversations, for example, about alcohol policy, space is integral to it, but maybe in ways that sometimes we don't see or sometimes we don't think about. So, I also want to highlight here that, for the 140 people who are part of this conversation, some of you, many of you, all of you really come from spaces that are not like Columbia and Barnard, because every campus is different. And so what we're trying to provide here is a framework for analysis rather than a set of solutions. Like, what we're proposing is to say, this is a set of glasses that you can put on to kind of look at your campus and then see things that we didn't see at Columbia and Barnard, but that could be really important as modifiable dimensions of what's going on. So an example of that is, like, Columbia and Barnard are pretty much fully residential colleges and universities. Most students in the United States don't go to fully residential colleges and universities, and many end up moving off campus pretty quickly. And so thinking about the modifiable aspects of campus life in those campus contexts is going to be different than it would be in the Columbia context. It doesn't mean that space is unimportant. It just means that it's going to be a little bit different. And so I think, like, when thinking about diversity, to sort of wrap this long answer up a little bit, the first is to think about space and power and how space augments existing power relationships, and how space also, in doing so, naturalizes certain kinds of behaviors on college campus that we may want to try to modify a little bit. And then the second is to think about a broader spatial analysis that's sort of done locally, so that, we're not sort of giving you an off-the-shelf, here are 3 solutions that you can use on your campus right now today, but instead, here's a vision that you can sort of enlist other people in, so that we build a kind of bigger tent of a group of people who view themselves as sexual assault stakeholders and also sexual assault prevention advocates. To return to Scott Wright, I mean, I think it was pretty exciting for him to think about how he could do something about sexual assault. Like, he never thought that that was part of his job, or that his job could actually move the needle. And I think he sort of realized that there may be some possibility that he could be part of it. And, the time that we've spent with so many administrators made it just so abundantly clear how committed everyone was to trying to create a campus where everyone could thrive. And so opening up opportunities for people to do that in ways that they might not have imagined before can be really empowering. And we think this space discussion is actually like it's hugely underleveraged for building those kinds of coalitions.
Well, I certainly, I have to laugh because, you hit some of the things that have affected me throughout my career in facilities, particularly space and power, and, colleagues crying about, or, in my case, coming and whining and saying, I need a bigger office. All of that, I never really thought about it in terms of this subject. And as you said, now bringing this to the discussion of facilities and the discussion of design and such, and the potential to be a part of helping to solve this problem, which we have throughout, higher ed, probably throughout the world, is really empowering. And so I'm really pleased to be a part of it. And that brings me to what is probably the hardest question, right? And that is, what should a campus do? And, particularly within the realm of affordable actions that, facilities is always underfunded. So, what should a campus do to help in this manner?
So yeah, we're not going to suggest that every campus needs to build new palaces for undergraduates as a route to prevention. And there was a reason that our first conversation with the Arrive Center was titled From Compliance to Transformation, because what a lot of campuses are doing now is programming that essentially boils down to well-meaning messages that young people shouldn't assault each other, which, as Shamus said, that's not bad. That means that you are in compliance with the law by at least making a good faith effort to tell people to act better. And yet, transformation involves bringing in new stakeholders. And so you all, as the people who are in charge of facilities, are sort of a key constituency, but I'm going to give maybe the most boring possible suggestion for a first step, which is to have a meeting, but a meeting where you can figure out who else shapes the campus physical environment. Because sure, you all are in charge ultimately, maybe for green lighting a new project. But there are a lot of other stakeholders. Think about coaches, for example. We found at Columbia that athletics had very strong and well-reasoned ideas for their requirement that first-year athletes should live with other first-year athletes. So athletics is going to have a set of policies and informal practices that shape the campus physical environment. Plus, when you think about all those teams traveling across the country, they're taking their sexual geography with them, right, to hotels and buses. And so thinking about not even just the physical, the specific limited physical campus environment, but so bringing in athletics, bringing in residential life, and beginning to do in that first meeting what Shamus and I are calling a spatial audit, which is to map out both the physical allocation of space on campus and then the policies that have produced that space, with attention to the allocation of space, who has the most space, but also who has the most desirable space, who has access to the different spaces. It's a complicated thing that I can't exactly explain in the next 1 minute. But what I am going to do is just drop in the chat a sign up so that if people, once we have our space audit mapping tool ready, anybody who wants it will be posted on our website. And I mean, we're very open source in the same way that the Arrive Center is. So think about the policies that produce that configuration, whether it's roommate selection or the availability of mixed year housing or athletics, as I said, or cost. To sort of begin by acknowledging the path dependence that will make it hard to change, right? There is a reason that campuses have the physical setup that they have now, and you can't change it unless you understand what has produced it. But then start with the possible, right? One campus that we've been in conversation with, they totally got the sexual geographies thing, and they decided that it shouldn't be the captains of the most prestigious team sports that have the best suites in the best senior dorm, but rather it should be the students with the highest GPAs. So like, that's a change. We don't think it's the change that we would have made. We would have said like, okay, we want those suites to go to first gen low income students so that they have space where they can really feel at home, because they're the people who have the heaviest lift in terms of feeling at home on campus. But so think about how you can change the distribution of space. Think about the lounges and shared space. Like that is not a super, I mean, I'm not the one buying the couches, so maybe it's easy for me to say it's not a super expensive change to make, but even like every single lounge that we saw, there were 0 couches. There were only armchairs. And I think that like that is understandable in the city that people want to have their own private space, but that means like no snuggling with your friends because it's very hard to fit 2 people in an armchair. So just to really think about, I mean, not impossible, but hard, to really think about the furnishing of the shared spaces, how to make that the most welcoming and accessible possible. There was a lot of kitchen space that we saw in the dorms that was very underused and in many cases like super unappealing. So think like if you're gonna make a space, think about or talk with the students to be like, okay, if you're buying all those stoves, like, is that really the best choice? Is that what the students want? Like, are they gonna use them? It's hard to cook in a space if there's no spices or olive oil in the cupboards, and those was like the tragedy of the commons, those sad kitchens. So without, but not to beat up on Columbia and their kitchens, but just to say like, if the shared space is so precious, really be intentional about how it's allocated. And then the broader message is to think, as we've said, I think again and again in this conversation, when you're planning space, how can you undo inequality? Or how can you work against inequality? Or at minimum, how can you allocate space so that it doesn't amplify inequalities, right? So that should, like, we would say like, that's the bar that we want you to get over. Another thing to think about, in particular in terms of first year students, is how heavy policing of substance use for first year students produces, we would say it produces harm, because it drives those students. Not all of those students are going to want to drink super hard, but the ones who are, it drives them into spaces they don't control, where they have to suck up to a senior to get anything other than shitty warm beer, right? And in fact, where like the hard alcohol is kept upstairs. And so it's not just sucking up to somebody, it's going upstairs with them, right? But then that is an environment that's produced by first year students not being able to drink and host parties in their own dorms. So we advocate classic public health, taking a harm reduction approach and acknowledging that students who are going to want to host parties can do so on terrain that they control. You asked when we spoke before this conversation about the feeling that you got in reading the book that like we're very pro-suite and anti other housing arrangements. And so, you know, we didn't, admittedly, there is an appeal of those suites because people have both private space for sex and then shared space for socializing. And yet there's a lot of social complications in configuring a group of people to live in a suite. Students love the, I can't remember what you called them. Oh, the double loaded corridor. Like some of the most fun times that students have are in those double loaded corridors. So we're not saying never have that. We're just saying make sure that there's a lounge, and students also need to think about, as Joe was saying in the beginning, think about that when you are pushed into someone's room, because when you go into someone's room, because that's the only place you can be alone, that just because you sit down on the bed with someone, it doesn't mean that you want to have sex, and it doesn't mean that they want to have sex. So there is an element of these sexual geographies that involves helping students move through them more intentionally, but that's really not our A game. Our A game is shaping the geographies themselves. And the people assembled in this Zoom are the ones who have the power to begin those conversations on their campuses.
Wow. Yeah, so you're right. and I started with a comment about one of the things that happened to me during, again, design of many, many residence halls. And that was the taking away of those lounges, because if you take that lounge and make it into a bedroom, then the project gets revenue from those beds. And as we talk about this more and more, that having those lounges, especially when you have the double loaded corridor style, becomes, I think, more and more critical than I ever realized when I was designing space. And so that's really interesting. And then when you talk about the kitchen space as well, you know, you think about in a home, the kitchen often becomes the center of the activity, and everybody is like sitting around a nice table, right, and some nice chairs while somebody's doing some cooking, and, you know, somebody else maybe is helping out. But if you don't have all the basic stuff that you need to kind of create that environment, if it's just some counters and a stove, you didn't create that environment where you could actually have that interaction around a kitchen. That is a very common social interaction type of thing. So do we have a little bit of time here? I think so. I'm going to give you a speculation question, and mostly because it relates to this whole lounge thing. And that is that, you know, during COVID, one of the problems that we encountered was we needed to remove gathering spaces and close them off, because that's where the spread was occurring, especially in the higher ed institution area. And the hope is that maybe we can reverse that and maybe even go beyond where we were and increase even more gathering space as a result of the work you've done. Is there anything that you could add on that? And again, I know it's a lot of speculation not based on your research, but anything you could offer on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, like, I'm a little loath to talk about COVID as an opportunity, because I think there's something just really distasteful about that. But I do think that there's something that we can recognize about how, you know, student culture is not like it doesn't just naturally reproduce itself. Students turn over kind of almost every 3 years, right? So the freshmen, by the time they get to being seniors, like the seniors are long gone, and the new freshmen coming in are totally new. And right now on a lot of campuses, more than half of the campus will kind of have like never been there or not spent a lot of time there. And like 3/4 of the campus will have maybe only spent a year there, right? So like it's actually kind of a moment for us to think about, like, what does the reinvention look like right now? And I think if we think about socializing, you know, it's a word that we've been using in this conversation that captures a wide range of activities. Because some of the socializing is like two people who maybe don't go back to a bedroom. In other contexts, we're talking about a 50-person party, right? And so as we begin to sort of reimagine campus life and maybe use that reimagination to try and institute different dynamics of campus cultures, I think that there's a few things that we can think about within this context. And I'm a little off script here, but like it's been one of the things that I've been working on recently at my own institution is to get, you know, there are programs where people teach architecture here. And so one of the things that I've done is get an architecture class to use these ideas to make proposals about redesigning campus life. And it serves a kind of pedagogical purpose of having the architects think about, you know, the social consequences of space usage. And it's also like a way to have like free consultation with a series of creative ideas, because you can kind of say to them, like, here's, like, you need to come up with the solution you come up with cannot be, we're going to spend $2 billion building all new dorms, right? Like, that is not the solution you're allowed to come up with. You have to come up with exceptionally low cost solutions based upon this sort of framework. And so, when thinking about building in stakeholders here, reaching out perhaps to some of the range of resources on campus to reimagine with you as a kind of collective enterprise can be really valuable. I also think it's really important, we talked about Scott Wright a lot, but the other really important group that we interacted with during the course of our research were students. And so building students into the redesign process, because they're going to be like the end users themselves, is important. Now, I suspect in many instances, you'll hear what we also heard from students, which is like study space, study space, study space. Probably like more singles, or I'm not sure what it will be in different campuses. And there'll be a little bit of tension around that, but I think it can be a good creative tension that people can exploit. In terms of, the COVID, I think that the response around large socialization spaces was right and better than like, a kind of sex panic around COVID, because as it turns out, like, sexual activity in COVID was not the big risk. Like, choir practice was the big risk. And it's, hard for us to sometimes recognize that because we frequently pathologize sex and see it as a problem activity or behavior. I also think that we should think about, like, as we're doing this kind of spatial audit, like, what are the range of spaces that are highly constrained at certain times, but actually highly available at other times? And so, classes happen during the day and student life happens a lot of time at night. And trying to imagine what could be possible for students at other times is really valuable. And I will note that, like, the students who don't drink often get the sort of like least consideration when it comes to student socialization. And even if their events are like not hugely attended, I think building them into our values is going to be super important. But I think, like, my big answer to your question is, most students will not have spent much time on campus for the next basically 2.5 years. And that gives us a little bit of an opportunity to, where students would think of some policy changes as a huge affront to their rights because it's quote unquote always been that way. I think over the next 2 years, we are at a little bit of a critical opportunity moment, because the sort of student memory of what campus life was and what the rules and regulations were and what they have to be is going to pivot a little bit. So, existing space can be kind of reapportioned in, I think, important ways to help us create contexts where students can thrive. And our assumption here as part of our research is that thriving isn't just about sexual assault. So when we make the arguments that we make in the book about sexual assault, and this is in some ways a little like preview of the future discussions that Joe had sort of indicated we would have, we talk about sexual assault as being part of sort of 4 major challenges on campus that are interrelated: diversity, equity, and inclusion, mental health, sexual violence, of course, and then substance use. And so, in imagining this transformation, this spatial transformation in this post-COVID moment, that spatial audit that Jennifer was talking about should bring in people who do work on mental health, should bring in diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates on campus, and should bring in people who do work on substance use, to all sort of collectively think together about how each one of them is doing sort of mutually beneficial work for the others. that the building of diversity, equity, and inclusion fundamentally challenges existing power dynamics on campus, and that can be really beneficial. It can also help with creating new dynamics around substance use in social space, and that those things can really improve the mental health of students, because we know that the more disadvantaged students on campus have greater mental health struggles. And so, building those four things together as a collective plank to sort of reimagine space builds this sort of big tent of a group of people, and it can have multiple potentially measurable outcomes that aren't just about sexual violence, which is really difficult to measure actually, but that is also about feelings of belonging on campus, the rates of substance use, and the overall mental health and satisfaction of students, particularly minoritized students who often feel alienated.
Wow. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank both Jennifer and Shamus for this discussion. And I hope that through this, we can bring a greater awareness to the facilities staff, to the planners, the architects, the engineers, to incorporate thoughts about this as part of the work that we do. Because as I said, my eyes were opened through reading the book and having this conversation. And I think that there's a lot more that we can do if more and more people recognize that sexual geography is a piece of this discussion that needs to become a routine part of the work that we do in facilities in higher ed. With that, I will turn it back over to Joe.
Thank you, Karren. The book is Sexual Citizens. The study is a landmark look at how we are doing and how we can do in the future. The authors, Shamus Khan and Jennifer Hirsch. The future is up to those who are on this webinar. Thank you to Jennifer and to Shamus for donating their time and being so generous with their time. Please join us at the end of the month for the third in our four-part series. We're going to have them both on the SUNY payroll at some point. They're giving us so much time. Thank you, Karren, for always standing with us every time we have any project or goal in reducing the impact of assault and harassment on campus. Karren is first in line, and she brings the entire facilities group with her. On behalf of Elizabeth and me, our entire Arrive team, what a privilege to have you. Thank you to Jennifer and Shamus. We'll see you again at the end of the month at the Spectrum Conference. Take care, everyone.